Welcome to this online lesson asking the question, what is the big story of medicine circa 1200 to present? This is a GCSE lesson which might be useful for revision, or as an introduction to the topic, or as a basic overview. However you're going to use this, pick and choose which tasks that you want to do unless you've been told to do them all. However, the overall aims of this lesson are to define basic chronological terms and to make a judgment on overall progress through British medicine. Now, the challenge level in this lesson will get increasingly hard as we go through, culminating in an exam-style question. So if you find early bits too basic, by all means skip forward a few screens. Here's a do now task to get us going though. Here are 4 images of historical medicine, in this case surgery or dissection. You need to study these and try and put them in chronological order. I've labelled them A, B, C and D, but you need to rearrange those into the right chronological order. And chronological means the order of when things happened from earliest to most recent. So, what is the chronological order of these images? What dates do you think that these cover, at least approximately? And how would you describe the change across time overall? Pause the video while you attempt those questions. Okay, first of all, let's put them in chronological order, get a sense for when these things were and what they show. So if you need to improve your answer, here's your chance. Our earliest image is B. This is medieval head surgery from circa 1400. It is unlikely that anyone undertaking this particular procedure would survive, at the very least from infection. However, in desperate measures, this might not have been quite such a ridiculous thing as you think. Even today, modern surgeons can open up the skull to relieve pressure on the brain to treat head injuries, and so in medieval battle this might have been a desperate last-ditch attempt to save somebody's life. Our next most distant is this one here, C. This is from the Renaissance period and it shows a dissection. That body is not being operated on, it is dead. That's from around 1550, although it could be a little bit earlier. Our next is A. This is 19th century surgery with anaesthetics. I've placed this at around 1860. However, it could be slightly later, it could be slightly earlier, although I would probably go with earlier. The anaesthesia being used here is on the cloth being put over the patient's mouth, and it's probably something called chloroform, which would knock people out. However, none of the doctors are taking antiseptic precautions. They're not spraying the area with antiseptics, and they are not covering their mouths and their hands and the rest of their bodies with shall we say, antibacterial coverings. That's in stark contrast to our most recent image, D, which is from around 1960, showing modern aseptic surgery, where the idea is to prevent all infection entirely. So how would we describe the change across time? Well, hopefully we can see that things are becoming more and more sophisticated. So early on we've got a pretty brutal procedure with the medieval head surgery, then there's greater understanding of the body in the Renaissance, which would certainly have aided our 19th century surgeons, which are being less brutal because of the use of anaesthetics, and then something that might be called recognisably modern in image D. A reintroduction to chronology. Okay, if you've already mastered this sort of thing, you can skip past this part. However, if you're in any way unsure, it's well worth bearing with it and going through a few introductory activities to kind of reacquaint you with this particular terminology. Chronology is a key part of history. It is the study of time and the placing of events in time. Chronology is very important to historians and your understanding of history. Historians tend to divide history into different chunks of time to describe the past. Take for example the basic timeline I've got on the right, dividing up ancient, medieval and modern history with some basic definitions. Also, historians divide time up into chunks, such as decades, 10 years, centuries, 100 years, and periods, e.g. the Industrial Revolution. Most historians agree the Industrial Revolution lasts from about 1750 to 1900, but periods might be shorter than that or longer than that. Also, we divide time up with key events such as the Black Death. These might last a single day or they might last years, but we can still refer to them as specific events within wider history. Alright, if you're unclear on any of that, you might want to make some notes now. If not, we'll move on. Let's consider how well you know time. Jot these down briefly. Answer these 3 questions. You have only 3 minutes to answer them, so don't hang about. We are living in the what century? 1200 to 1299 is known as the what century. There are 100 years in a what? The 20th century was the year what to what, and the First World War was in the what century. I'll give you an extra mark if you can pick out the dates of the First World War as well. Right, 3 minutes to do those. You can pause the video while you do them, and then we'll have a look at the answers. Done? Let's see how many you've got right. By all means, correct anything that you need to. We are living in the 21st century. 1200 to 1299 is known as the 13th century. There are 100 years in a century. The 20th century was the year 1900 to 1999. And the First World War was in the 20th century as well. And the dates for that were 1914 to 1918. Pause the video if you need to make any corrections. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next task. A little tip on working out how we refer to different centuries. The easiest way to work out which century we're referring to is to cover up the last two numbers of a date and then add 1 to the first two numbers. For example, the year 1459 is in the 15th century. If we cover up the 5 and the 9, we're left with 14, add 1 to that, that's the 15th century. There's a very logical reason for this. Think about the first century. That would be from the year 1 to the year 99, wouldn't it? And then the second century would be from the year 100 to the year 199, and so forth. So that's why it's always one more than those first two digits. So you can practice that here. Answer the following, and just spend a couple of minutes doing this. The year 1584 is in the which century? Remember how to work it out. And then do the same for 1275, 2010, 1899 and 654. Oh, bear in mind too that that's how we read these dates. We wouldn't say the year 1584, we would say 1584. Or if we've only got 3 digits, it would be 654 rather than 654. Pause the video while you complete those tasks, and like I say, don't spend long on it. Time to go through some answers. Make your corrections if you need to. The year 584 is in the 16th century. 1275 is in the 13th century. 2010 is in the 21st century. 1899 is right at the end of the 19th century. And 654 is in the 7th century. Note too that sometimes these dates will have AD and BC, but we're not going to go into that for now. The main part of this lesson, we're going to create a timeline, and it'll look something like this. I thoroughly recommend that you do this on a piece of paper. A4 paper should be plenty big enough for this. However, if you do it on the computer, that's up to you, but I often find that a lot more fiddly than just getting out a piece of paper, a pencil and a ruler. If you're going to do this on a standard letter-sized piece of paper, say A4 sized, then your scale should be 3 centimetres equals 1 century. That means that your central line along the middle there will be 27 centimetres long, and you'll make a little mark like I've done too at the start and the end of it, and every 3 centimetres in between. You can then label it with the names of the centuries, 12th, 13th and so on. Okay, if you want to start out drawing your timeline like that, then do so now, bearing in mind that you're going to have to write things either side of it. So draw it in the middle of the page just as you see on your screen there. Okay, pause the video while you do that. Right, I'm hoping that you haven't had to rub that out and start again too many times. It's usually worth doing this with a pencil if you're at all clumsy with a timeline. So, we're now going to add on the dates that correspond to the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries and so forth. I've written this quite large on the screen just so you can read it easily. You'll probably want to write it a little bit closer to the line. So with our first one, the 12th century would be 1100 to 1199, the 13th century 1200 to 1299 and so forth. You can add the rest, or you can wait for me to just display them on the screen. It's up to you. Right, hopefully you've got all of your dates added onto your timeline now. If you want to pause the video and just check that you haven't messed anything up, then now's a good opportunity to do so. If not, we'll see how we're going to build upon this timeline, adding key events and periods to those dates. Bear in mind, if you haven't noted down those headings, it's well worth doing that as well. The race against time. You are now going to see a selection of periods, key events, life expectancies and medical events. You need to sort them into the correct chronological order on your graph. Some have dates, but many of them do not. This is about your thinking about the progress of medicine. So it's well worth doing these in pencil so that if you need to make any corrections or if you change your mind as you're going along, you don't ruin your timeline. So what we'll have a look at next is what these periods, key events, life expectancies and medical events are. We'll be able to categorise them and then add them onto the timeline at the very least approximately. Here we see them full screen. Hopefully you can read those easy enough. I'm going to use a key of colour coding to show you the different types of information. Firstly, periods are shown in purple. I'm going to show you one now as a pointer. There we go. The Industrial Revolution counts as a period. Key events are shown in blue. I'm going to highlight one now. The English Civil War. Life expectancies I'm going to show in green. Here's one highlighted. And lastly, medical events I'm going to show in red. Here's one highlighted there. So medical events are events, but they are more specifically about medicine. All right, I recommend that you pause the video here and spend about 20 minutes populating your timeline with plenty of information. And like I say, if you're in any doubt about it, leave it in pencil so that you can correct it once we see the answers. Because after this, we are going to have a look at an example of what it should look like. Anyway, enough from me. Pause the video and create your timeline now. Let's have a look at what your timeline should look like. Right, very roughly speaking, here are our periods. So we've got the Middle Ages is the earliest one, circa 1250 to 1500. Then we've got the Renaissance period from 1500 to 1700, the Industrial Revolution from 1700 to 1900, and the modern period from 1900 to 2000 and indeed beyond. These are very approximate and there's no hard and fast rule as to when these begin and end, so don't moan at me and say, oh sir, the medieval period extends well before that. Yes, I'm aware of that, but we are going to simplify it just for the purposes of dividing up our timeline and our medical events. The dates we've already had a look at, now let's have a look at the medical events. The first hospitals in Britain were around in the 13th century. Hospitals were not always as we imagine them today. Yes, they often cared for the sick, but the term hospital relates to hospitality. They were a place for people to stay if they needed to, and very often these people were sick if they were on their way, for example, to a place of pilgrimage. However, dissection was banned by the Catholic Church in the 14th century. This made it very difficult to study the human body, and therefore lots of mistakes that had been made by earlier societies were carried over into later times. However, during the Renaissance period, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, the first proper dissections occurred with people able to study the human body and explain it and understand it a huge amount better. Blood circulation was discovered by a man called William Harvey in the 17th century or 1600s. Smallpox inoculations were first tried in the 18th century, and these aren't quite the same as vaccinations. This is where you get a weakened form of smallpox, but you might catch the real thing. But by the end of the 18th century and going into the 19th century, vaccinations are increasingly introduced to fight smallpox, and of course, more recently, other diseases such as COVID-19. Germs are discovered around the middle of the 19th century with the work of Louis Pasteur. The NHS was set up in 1948 and DNA was discovered in 1953. So that gives us a very basic and not especially precise timeline of key medical events. The life expectancies, as you might expect with all this progress, go from a pretty measly 32 around about the 14th century up to about 40 from the 17th century onwards, and then a life expectancy of about 65 by the middle of the 19th century. By the end of the 20th century, life expectancy was up around 78. It should be pointed out that especially some of these early life expectancies, like 32 and 40, are heavily skewed by the number of very sad infant deaths. An awful lot of babies died before their first birthday, and children died in infancy too. That skews the life expectancies to go right down. So don't be thinking that there were no old people at this time. There absolutely were. If you reached the age of 30, you had a pretty good chance of reaching 60 in the Middle Ages. And here are our key wider events. The Black Death, at least in England, was from 1348 to 1349. The Great Fire of London took place in 1666, but just preceding that, the English Civil War was in 1642 to 51. The Second World War and the First World War were in the 20th century. So the First World War was 1914 to 1918 and the Second World War 1939 to 1945. Pause the video and make any corrections or improvements that you need to with your timeline, because you are going to need an accurate timeline for the next part. We're now going to look at the big picture. Assessing your timeline. How would you describe the change in medicine between 1250 and 2000? What historical words would you use to describe it? You can make some basic introductory notes on that now, or we can proceed straight to the exam style question. Trends through time. You now need to explain what you have learnt about chronological development of British medicine. The text here is going to be pretty small, so if you're not already watching this full screen, I recommend you do so. Using your timeline and the keyword bank, which I will put up shortly, answer the question below. Explain how medicine progressed between 1250 and 2000. This is equivalent to a 12-mark answer in the Edexcel specification. However, I should point out that it's hugely unlikely that they're going to set you a question like this. These explain or analysis type questions that are 12 marks usually have a much narrower date range or just relate to a particular period or event, so be wary of that. However, this is just an overview and an introduction, so we don't have to be, in this instance, quite so precise as that. Now, the Edexcel exam will give you 2 stimulus points or clues to help you with each question. You may use the following in your answer: life expectancy and the discovery of germs. However, to get all 6 marks for knowledge, you will need to include information of your own as well. So if there are 6 marks for knowledge, that means there are 6 for your analysis as well. It's really important to link your answer back to the question about how medicine progressed. So for that reason, here's my top tip for how to answer. Use 3 point, example, explain and link paragraphs. That will typically give you enough depth and breadth in terms of knowledge, but also give you enough opportunity to show your understanding of this key concept of historical change and progress. Peel works like this: point, example, explain and link. Firstly, make your point. One way medicine progressed was. Then you give it a specific example. An example of this was. Then you explain the effects or impact of that. The effect of this was, or this involved. And then you link it back to the question, in this case, how medicine progressed. This helped medicine progress because. Don't feel that you have to use this writing frame, but if you're unfamiliar with writing in this sort of structured and focused way, it's not a bad idea to. But that's not all. At the end, you need to give a brief conclusion. So, conclude overall. What was the most important example of progress? Or what was the overall trend in progress? You can choose either here, but just explain in a short paragraph again. To help you out even further, here are some keywords that you might want to use: progress, rapid, slow, partial and development. Okay, pause the video here and you should give yourself about 18 minutes to answer the question. This is based on the idea that most questions will require about 1.5 minutes per mark to answer. So 1.5 times 12 would be 18. Pause the video here and off you go. Good luck. Okay, let's have a look at an example answer. I say an example answer because it's probably not perfect, this one here. It's one that I've typed up in about 10 minutes. But I don't think it's bad, and it gives a reasonable breadth of what an answer should look like. For my example answer, I'm going to colour code my points in red, examples in blue, explanations in green, and then my links back to the question will be in purple. Don't feel that you need to follow exactly the same format. I'm not trying to stifle your writing style here. I'm just trying to show how you might write in a focused way within the time that you have available. One way medicine progressed was increases in life expectancy. For example, in the 14th century, life expectancy was about 32 years old, whereas by the end of the 20th century, it had increased to 78. This was because fewer people died from disease young, as knowledge of preventing and treating disease had improved, particularly for the very young. This shows slow progress in medicine because more lives were being saved that had otherwise been lost before, and so people were surviving to an older age. Right, notice there I've used my first of the stimulus points. So I'm getting round towards getting some of my knowledge marks for the specifics I'm putting in there, and I'm linking it back to this idea about progress in medicine, in this case slow progress in medicine, which links back to the question nicely. So picking up marks for both AO1 knowledge and AO2 analysis with that first paragraph. But there's not enough yet. Another example of progress was that key discoveries were made. For example, in the 1860s, germs were identified as a key cause of disease. This meant that preventative measures to stop people becoming infected by bacteria were developed. This brought rapid progress, as it meant that preventative health measures could be more effective by being better focused on preventing germs. Okay, you might just be encountering the medicine through time topic for the first time recently, but what we will find is this is a massive breakthrough. Infectious diseases such as cholera, which were spread by germs in the water, previously people were really using their best guesses to try and prevent it, and none of the preventions, which usually focused around smell, for example, were particularly effective. So that justifies why I've put rapid progress there, even if I've not included all of that specific detail in the paragraph. Finally, medicine progressed because of scientific advances. For example, in the Renaissance, human dissections became more common, and in the 20th century, the structure of DNA was identified. These advances allowed other discoveries to be made and could be applied to more effective medical treatments. This advanced medicine as it showed that scientific advances could bring greater accurate understanding of how to treat and prevent disease. I just need my conclusion now. I've decided to go with looking at the most important development to justify my answer rather than looking at the overall trend, but both would be acceptable. Overall, the most important aspect of progress was scientific discovery. Such advances enabled other developments such as the discovery that germs cause disease and improve public health. This could then lead to more diseases being treated and prevented, resulting in increased life expectancy. And increased life expectancy is one of the most powerful indicators that medicine progressed between 1200 and 2000. Possibly not a perfect answer, but not a bad effort. If you want to make any improvements to your own answer, you can do so now, particularly if you haven't got enough examples down or if you haven't been linking it back to the question. If you have got enough down, then well done. I hope that this video has been of use to you and that you found it interesting, because that's the end of this online lesson. I'll say thank you very much for watching. If it has been of use, by all means like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, I'll say good health.